Like a garden snail leaves a trail behind, our story snail leaves a tail behind. Share our stories and you may find you can tell a story too.
Guten Morgen, everyone. And welcome to another Snail Tales Assembly. It's still the time of Advent here, as you can probably tell by the decorations. But I welcomed you this morning in the German language because, well, as you probably noticed, I'm dressed up a little bit differently to normal. I'm dressed up to look like an Anglo-Saxon because about 1,100 years ago, Anglo-Saxons lived in this part of the world. And the language that the Anglo-Saxons used was much closer to German than it was to English today. But it wasn't just the Anglo-Saxons who were here back then. Just a little over 1,100 years ago, the Vikings had come over to the island of Britain and taken over pretty much every single Anglo-Saxon kingdom. There was only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom left, the Kingdom of Wessex, which was ruled over by a king called Alfred. Maybe you've heard of Alfred. He's often remembered as Alfred the Great, but at the start of this story, he probably didn't feel very great. Because you see, Alfred and his Anglo-Saxon army had been fighting the huge Viking army, and both armies were actually really good. They'd been fighting for a whole day without it looking like one side was going to win. So the Viking leader put up his hand and called out to Alfred, "Let's have a moment of peace. Let's go home, get some sleep, get some rest, and we'll come back and we'll keep on fighting tomorrow. Sound like a good idea? Let's shake hands on it." Alfred did think it was a good idea. He thought his soldiers would really appreciate getting an extra night of rest. So he shook hands with the Vikings, and he and all of his Anglo-Saxon army turned around. But the Vikings didn't. They threw their spears and threw their axes right into the backs of the Anglo-Saxons. So, of course, that meant that the Vikings won. They didn't just destroy Alfred's army, but they also destroyed his home by setting fire to it. And Alfred, he had no choice but to run into the forest to hide, a weak and defeated king. That doesn't sound very great, does it? While he was hiding there in the forest, though, Alfred decided he was going to remember how tricky the Vikings were. He had to remember that. Vikings are tricky. I wonder if you can say that with me to help Alfred remember it. Vikings are tricky. Now, while he was there in the forest, Alfred decided he had to go around in secret. Because if the Vikings found out where he was, well, they would probably kill him. So he had to remember that. He had to remember to always go around in secret. Say it with me again. What's he got to remember? Vikings are tricky and always go around in secret. There's quite a lot to remember there already, isn't there? Maybe we can get some words on the screen to help us remember. What's he got to remember? Vikings are tricky and always go around in secret. While he was going around in secret, though, Alfred kept an eye on those Vikings. He watched them as they were slowly taking over all the towns and villages in Wessex. But he noticed that every single Sunday, the Vikings would have a big party. They wouldn't do any fighting, they wouldn't really do any work, they would just have a big party. And Alfred began to wonder, maybe that could be useful to remember too. So he decided he was definitely going to remember that. Vikings party on Sundays. Do you think you can help me remember that? All of it, I mean. Let's start from the beginning. Vikings are tricky, always go around in secret, and Vikings party on Sundays. Perfect. That wasn't the only thing that Alfred noticed, though. He also spotted that on the day after their party, Monday morning, the Vikings would spend a lot longer in bed. That might have been an important thing to remember too. So Alfred decided he was definitely going to remember Vikings sleep in on Mondays. Say it with me. What's he got to remember? Vikings are tricky, always go around in secret, Vikings party on Sundays, and Vikings sleep in on Mondays. After a few weeks trying to remember all of this and hiding out there in the forest, Alfred was getting very hungry. He only really had berries and things to eat. And his face was covered in a really thick beard. His hair had grown extra long. Even his kingly armour and clothes had started to get really dirty and rather smelly, not like a king at all. So Alfred decided to take a chance and go into one of the villages of Wessex, knock upon someone's door and ask them for some food, a drink, and maybe somewhere to lie down. He went into a little village and knocked upon a door, and it was opened by a woman who had a very suspicious look on her face. But Alfred, remember, keeping himself secret, said to her that he was just a soldier, an ordinary soldier, who had been wandering around, lost and alone since the battle, and he was desperate for some food and some water and somewhere to lie down, if she could only spare a little. Well, when the lady heard that, she threw open her door, welcoming Alfred inside, saying of course he could come in. Saxons always look out for each other. And Alfred liked the sound of that. He decided he was going to remember that. Saxons always look out for each other. What's he got to remember? Vikings are tricky, always go around in secret. Vikings party on Sundays, Vikings sleep in on Mondays, and Saxons always look out for each other. And once he'd come inside, the woman said to Alfred, "I'm so glad you're here. You can actually help me too. You see, I have been baking some cakes for my husband and I to eat when he gets home. But we also wanted to go out and get some drink. And I couldn't go out and get the drink while the cakes were cooking because, well, they might burn. So could you look after them for me? Could you please make sure that the cakes don't burn while I go out and get the drink?" Alfred thought that this lady had been so kind to him. It was only a little thing that she was asking him to do. So as the lady left, Alfred said to himself, he had to remember that, don't burn the cakes. What's he got to remember? Vikings are tricky, always go around in secret. Vikings party on Sundays. Vikings sleep in on Mondays. Saxons always look out for each other. And don't burn the cakes. So Alfred sat down in front of the oven, which in those days was a campfire, with some stones placed around it, and resting on top of the stones was a big bit of metal that the cakes sat on, and they looked really scrummy and smelled delicious. But as Alfred looked into the flames, it reminded him about how the Vikings had destroyed his home, setting fire to the buildings so that as the flames rose up, the buildings had crumbled down. The memory made Alfred feel such anger, such a real desire to get his own back on the Vikings, especially since they cheated really, hadn't they? They hadn't been fair at all. Why? Because Vikings are tricky. So Alfred wondered whether maybe he needed to be tricky to get his own back on the Vikings. If he was going to do that, though, he would need to get some Saxon soldiers to help him. Contacting the Saxon soldiers would be tricky to start with. He'd have to find a way of going around and bringing all of the Saxons together. What would be a good way to go around? Of course, always go around in secret. Well, what would be a really good day to go around without the Vikings noticing? A day maybe when the Vikings would be distracted by something else. Well, Vikings party on Sundays. And after he'd gathered up his soldiers, what would be a good day to attack. He needed a day when the Vikings would be feeling really lazy and sluggish and not really ready to fight at all. How about a day when they're sleeping in? Vikings sleep in on Mondays. That would be the perfect morning to attack the Vikings. But then Alfred began to wonder whether the Saxons would actually want to fight with him again. After all, so far he had led them into battle, and it didn't work very well. Still, the words of that lady came back to him in that moment. Saxons always look out for each other. And that gave Alfred the confidence that his plan was going to work. Soon his Saxon soldiers would gather up together and they would attack the Vikings and they would win. This time it would be the Vikings who were running off to hide, while their homes began to burn with flames that reached up to the sky, with a big smell like something delicious, as the Vikings all screamed, "What have you done to my cakes?" No, hang on a minute. That's not right, is it? What had Alfred forgotten? Don't burn the cakes! He had been concentrating so much on thinking about how to attack the Vikings, he hadn't noticed that the cakes had begun to burn. And the lady had come back to her home and was now standing above Alfred, looking really, really cross. Well, the first thing Alfred thought to do was stand up himself and say, "I am your king! You will not talk to me like that!" But then Alfred realised that actually this woman had every reason to be cross. She'd spent the whole day making these delicious cakes. So, instead of getting angry back, Alfred dropped down onto his knees and said, "I'm so sorry, good lady. You have been so kind to me, and I couldn't even do this one thing for you. I am such a bad king." And when Alfred looked up, he saw that the woman's face looked like this. Because now she recognised him. She saw that he was Alfred, the King of Wessex. But Alfred said, "Oh, good lady, do not worry. You have been really good to me today. You have also helped me to realise that Saxons always look out for each other. But not only that, you show me that it's important to keep an eye on the little things as well as the big things. Dear lady, I'm sure that with your help, we are going to be able to beat back the Vikings." And do you know what? That is exactly what happened. Alfred and his Saxons managed to beat the Vikings back to the other side of the island. And for many years afterwards, it was Alfred and his family who ruled over most of the kingdoms on the island of Britain. I'm pretty sure that's why he's known as Alfred the Great. But can you work out why we decided to tell that story during the season of Advent? Did you notice any waiting going on? Did you notice any preparation going on? Right now, though, it only remains for me to say cheerio and hope to hear your story soon. So, cheerio! I hope to hear your story soon.